Hello, and welcome to the Hadassah Magazine discussion, a joint program of Hadassah Magazine and Hadassah's Engagement Division. I'm Lisa Hostein, the executive editor of Hadassah Magazine. The magazine discussion is a bi-monthly event that enables us to delve a little deeper into content published in the magazine. In this case, a series of recent articles related to the surge in anti-Semitism in the United States and around the world. It's part of our ongoing coverage of the devastating Hamas massacre of October 7th, the ensuing war, and the repercussions that continue to occupy us so intensely. This is day 104, and the first-year birthday of poor Kfir Bibas, the red-headed infant taken hostage and whose fate is unknown and unimaginable, along with the other remaining hostages who are in our hearts. Anti-Semitism on college campuses is not a new phenomenon. It has been plaguing many campuses for several years, but has escalated dramatically since October 7th. At the same time, not all schools are on fire, which is what it would be easy to conclude if you're not actually on campus and only reading the reports, or if you're on one of the campuses that actually is on fire. Still, as you saw from some of the statistics we showed at the beginning, there is no question that many Jewish students are feeling less safe and less confident about expressing their Jewishness. Surveys conducted jointly by the Anti-Defamation League, Hillel, and College Pulse found that 73% of Jewish college students have experienced or witnessed some form of anti-Semitism since the beginning of the 2023-2024 school year. And 64% of Jewish students pre-October 7th felt very or extremely comfortable with others knowing they're Jewish. Now only 38.6% feel that way. The goal of this conversation is to get a better understanding of what's happening on the campuses and what is being done to counter these disturbing trends. We have brought together a very special panel, all players with different roles and therefore different perspectives. Before we begin, I want to thank those of you who are already Hadassah members and donors. Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization of America, is the largest Jewish women's organization in the United States. The group's mission is to effect change and advocate on such critical issues as ensuring the security of Israel, combating anti-Semitism, and promoting women's health care, including reproductive rights. And of course, also to support Hadassah's 2 world-class hospitals in Jerusalem, as well as youth aliyah villages that help at-risk children, and Young Judea, the Zionist youth movement. The work at Hadassah's 2 hospitals has become even more critical in times of emergency, with Hadassah treating hundreds of soldiers and civilians wounded in the October 7th attacks and the subsequent war. Just this week, Hadassah Medical Organization began the phased opening of its Gandel Rehabilitation Center on its Mount Scopus campus. The center will care for military and civilian casualties using the latest equipment and technology and will help meet Israel's urgent need for rehabilitative care. If you're not already a member, please consider joining Hadassah so you can be a part of the healing work that Hadassah does. It will entitle you to Hadassah Magazine, which is free with membership, as well as all the important programming like this that we provide. And of course, your donations for both this event and all of Hadassah's work are always welcome and valued. Links for both membership and donations are in the chat box. For this program, we welcome audience questions throughout the conversation, so please be sure to write them in the Q&A. The chat box is where we will disseminate information, including links to more about our panelists and their work. And now to introduce our panelists. Rabbi Gabe Greenberg is the executive director of the Hillel at the University of Pennsylvania. Gabe has worked in pluralistic Jewish settings around the country, serving as a rabbinic educator at UC Berkeley Hillel, a congregational rabbi in New Orleans, and the founder of an organic farming Jewish learning program in Baltimore. Aliza D. Lewin is the president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, a nonprofit organization established to advance the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and promote justice for all. The Washington-based Brandeis Center conducts research, education, and legal advocacy to combat the resurgence of anti-Semitism on college and university campuses. Aliza is also co-founder and partner in Lewin & Lewin LLP, where she has specialized in litigation, mediation, and government relations. She began her law career in Israel, where she clerked on the Supreme Court for Deputy President Justice Menachem Elon. She served as president of the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists from 2012 to 2017, and in 2020, she was awarded that organization's Distinguished Pursuit of Justice Award. Elizabeth Rand is a Manhattan-based attorney who works in the compliance department of a large insurance company. In October 2023, as the mother of a high school senior who had begun the college selection process, she founded the Facebook group Mothers Against College Antisemitism to give parents and other concerned individuals a platform to express their concerns about the rise in antisemitism on campuses across the country. And last but not least is Hannah Schlachter, an MBA candidate at the University of California, Berkeley Haas School of Business. Since October, she has led advocacy on Berkeley's campus and across California. Before business school, Hannah was chief of staff at an impact-focused venture capital firm in San Francisco, and she worked in management consulting for big tech clients in the Bay Area. As an undergraduate at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, she served as a student on the Hillel International Board of Directors and co-founded the Hillel International Student Cabinet. Welcome to you all. We have so much to discuss, and I want to start by directing a question to each of you to set the stage. Gabe, I'm going to start with you. You are at a campus that has been one of the epicenters of a lot of activity and discussion and press over the last several months. So I want to start really by asking you, what has been the experience of students, of Jewish students? And again, I know they're not monolithic and they all experience what's going on in different ways, but generally speaking, what can you tell us about the experience of students before October 7th versus post-October 7th?
Thank you so much for the question, and thank you for having me and for convening this webinar. I would be remiss if I did not open by saying how proud my bubby would be of that I'm speaking on a Hadassah webinar. My grandmother, Ricky Fenster. So bubby, we made it. Look, for many, the question begins on October 7th, but here at Penn, the question, this really began in September when Penn hosted the Palestine Rights Festival. That's Rights, WRITES. That was a festival that was 3 days, culminating on Erev Yom Kippur, where over 100 speakers, poets, artists came to campus. And of those over 100, at least a dozen of them had histories of anti-Semitic speech and writings, and we became aware of this and started to raise awareness around it, educate the university. That was a major to-do, and on some level, it felt like things would quiet down. But of course, October 7th was just 2 weeks later, and what's happened on campus has in some ways been a microcosm of what's happened around the country and around the world. But there were also things that were specific to higher ed and really unique things at Penn around rallies and marches and protest statements by students and faculty in the classroom, on social media, at protests, swastikas, an intruder into Hillel, one student assaulted at a protest, an Israeli flag stolen off students' residence, violent emails towards Hillel staff. So that's some of what's been happening here. Meanwhile, there was what was happening sort of on the university level. Penn's leadership, who really failed to meet the moment, which culminated in the president and the chair of the board of trustees resigning. And there was also an investigation by the Department of Education, which as of about a day ago was called off, but there are still investigations by Congress and by Pennsylvania and the EEOC. There's a civil lawsuit. So, and that this is all, this really came to a head in the second week of December, and then students left and just came back this week. So things have been quiet as of late, and we anticipate that they will ramp up again, certainly as long as the war is going on. So that's like a little bit of context. How is the mood for students? It's quite varied, as you noted. There are hundreds of Jewish students whose primary experiences have been feeling scared, afraid, angry, upset. That is a very dominant perspective. There are hundreds of students who feel confused, like they don't want to wade into this because it's so hyper polarized and binary that having any feelings of nuance or complication feels like that's not welcome. We have other students who are able to kind of put all of this aside and just focus on their work, and they don't really want to engage in this, and that's also okay. So there's a real diversity of student feeling. Though I will say that we're seeing more students engaged in a whole variety of activities in Hillel and outside of Hillel than we have in a long time. So that is on one foot a bit about mood and what's been going on here, and I look forward to hearing from everyone else.
No, thank you. That definitely is a succinct recap of a lot that's been going on for sure. And we'll have to see what happens now that students are only back their first day today, right? So, Hannah, I want to move to a campus across the country, although I didn't realize earlier that Gabe actually had experience at Berkeley as well. And Berkeley has also been seen as kind of one of the hot spots. So I want you to describe kind of what your experience was before October 7th, what's been going on since then, and specifically what prompted you to join a lawsuit filed in a federal court in San Francisco in November, alleging, quote, longstanding unchecked spread of anti-Semitism that needs court intervention to, quote, protect students and faculty and end anti-Semitic discrimination. Tell us about what's been going on with you.
Thank you, Lisa, for sharing. And thank you to all the panelists for including me. I'm really excited to be with all of you in this conversation. So I can answer the question around what my experience was before October 7th, share what it's been since October 7th, and also share, what we can make of just the moment that we're in, especially as I've been speaking with students from across the country who are leading efforts on their own campuses. I'd say, though, that the most important point that I can emphasize today is that we are at a critical junction in how our society sees Jew hate on campus right now. Prior to October 7th, there was this notion that anti-Semitism might have looked how it looked for my own grandparents many years ago, around the time of the Holocaust. And what we're seeing right now is that anti-Semitism isn't necessarily based on religion and what God I believe in or I pray to, but rather it's based on my national origin. So my ethnic identity and my shared ancestry with, Jews around the world. With that being said, prior to October 7th, I was thinking about this recently. Something felt off to me being a student at Berkeley because on one hand, I worked in social impact before coming to business school, and I have a lot of these social impact oriented values. And at the same time, as I became close with a lot of my classmates, it was clear that there's a part of me scared to show parts of my Jewish identity. And I think that probably the biggest one was, it's okay for me to have friends over for Shabbat dinner, but if I talk about my family in Israel and the trips I've had there, as well as the fact that I wanted to organize a trip to Israel, then that's when I would caution and I would censor myself for what I would and wouldn't say. And I've noticed that between over the last few months, and especially since the war began, the business school, and I would imagine many other, some law programs and other business schools across the country were a bit isolated from the hostility and behavior issues happening, in general on universities, especially at Berkeley. Haas, we have, very strong values that we maintain and how we conduct ourselves as students. And at the same time, there's this notion that a lot of the Jew hate on campus is going, it's disguised as anti-Zionism, disguised as social justice, etc. So as a student right now, for example, I'm actually required to take a course on DEI. And I don't feel comfortable in that class. On one hand, I don't feel comfortable because I know that how I see myself as being a diverse member in that classroom is not recognized as diversity by the person who's teaching that class. So I would say that to wrap all of this up, there's hostility happening across the country. My motivation for joining this lawsuit with Brandeis Center very much was because I wanted to see a legal precedent that what anti-Semitism looks like today very much includes anti-Zionism. Just as you don't hate against a Jewish person if they're kosher, you also shouldn't hate against a Jewish person if part of their identity is related to Zionism. So Thank you all so much for including me, and I'm excited to share more in our conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So, Elise, I'm going to turn to you. I was thinking 2 years ago, we had a program not dissimilar to this, anti-Semitism on campus. And at that point, we had written a big article. And at that point, we had kind of talked to you as kind of cutting edge in terms of some of the legal action that is being taken on campuses. And we thought it was really bad then, right? And obviously, things have, been exacerbated. You actually were part of there's a lot of legal components, and I really want you to try to break them down. So help us really understand, first and foremost, what happens when somebody comes to the Brandeis Center or the Campus Anti-Semitism Legal Line, which now you're partnering with Hillel and ADL and a private law firm to help provide free legal protection. What happens when a student comes to you? Just give us some of those steps of how you evaluate the complaint, what you do with it, and how do you know which ones to actually pursue that end up in a lawsuit like the one that Hannah's involved with.
So thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you also to Hadassah for putting together this really important program and for including me. It's really my pleasure to be here. And you're right. I mean, we're seeing now many, many more of these complaints filed both in federal court and with the Department of Education. And there's a reason for that, and that's because the law is a very, very powerful tool. Particularly, sometimes people may have heard about Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Universities have an obligation, a legal obligation, to protect their students from harassment and discrimination. Title VI applies to every institution that receives federal funds, and the condition of the receipt of that money is that they take the necessary steps. Right? This was enacted to try and protect against segregation, and now it's used to protect, right, against discrimination on the basis of race, color, national, ethnic origin. One of the things that is important, though, to note about Title VI is that it does not include religion as a protected category. And so that's one of the reasons when Hannah actually was talking and said it so beautifully, that it's really important for us to recognize and to gain the recognition by the legal components, right, by the courts, by the administrative agencies, that Jews are protected from discrimination, not just when it targets them on the basis of their religious practice, right, but also when it targets them on the basis of what we're seeing now, which is targeting Jews on the basis of our identity as a people and our history and our heritage, our ancestry, and our people's connection to the land of Israel. Right. For most Jews, they define their identity as including this piece, right? This piece that feels connected to Israel. So what happens when Jewish students feel that they're being targeted, right? Zionists aren't welcome. As Hannah was saying, this is not just about speech. This is not just about dehumanizing the Zionists. This is actually now about excluding the Zionists, shunning the Zionists, harassing the Zionists, marginalizing the Zionists, or even assaulting the Zionists, right? We are seeing this now on campuses. It's just escalating and becoming, unfortunately, after October 7th, much more common on many, many more campuses, and the level of the intensity and the severity and the violence is increasing. So what happens when a student contacts us? We get contacted by students, we get contacted by parents. They come either directly to the Brandeis Center. You can reach the Brandeis Center at info@brandeiscenter.com, or as you say, they reach out to the Campus Anti-Semitism Legal Line, which is at legal-protection.org. There's a little form there that you can fill out. Same if you send us a short email with just your contact information and a brief description. And then what happens is somebody from the Brandeis Center will reach out to the student, or if it comes through the call line, I've trained now over 150 volunteer lawyers who actually do the intake calls, because we've been getting now many, many intakes through the call line. And those lawyers will go through and interview the student or the parent, whoever is contacting us. Sometimes it's also faculty that reaches out to us, and find out the details, get the documentation, get the evidence. I will tell you, it's very important for students to try and document what is happening. If they're being harassed, screenshot. If it's online, screenshot it. And so they gather that evidence. And then what happens is we, as the lawyers, so it's either within the Brandeis Center or as part of the call line, we're with lawyers from the ADL, from Gibson Dunn, and from Hillel. We'll go through each and every one of these intake memos and we analyze them. But it's not, and it's really, really important for students to understand the legal support and assistance that we are providing it's much, much broader than just filing a complaint, right? Oftentimes what happens may not rise to the level of a formal complaint, but the student needs guidance. The student needs support. It could be that the student needs assistance in understanding how to frame what happened to them when they go to talk to administrators, so that the administrators actually see the harassment and discrimination for what it is, rather than think, oh, this is just speech and it's part of a political debate, right? The students need to understand a little bit about their legal rights, understand how to articulate this so that the universities will recognize it for what it is. Sometimes it may rise to the level of a letter that the Brandeis Center may end up sending to the university as opposed to a formal complaint. Other times it may rise to the level of complaint, and then we have to decide, well, is this something that should be filed with the Department of Education, which oversees these grants, right? The funding that they get and has the ability to withhold that funding. And so they can open an investigation. Or do you go to federal court and file a federal lawsuit? Now, in federal court, you do need a plaintiff. And that has sometimes seemed to be a barrier for students who don't want to be named plaintiffs. But as Hannah knows, for instance, in the case at Berkeley, the Brandeis Center is a membership organization. So we invite, and I would encourage everybody who's watching tonight, and perhaps, we could even partner. I'd be happy to have Hadassah send out, or even the Mothers Against Campus Antisemitism send out the link to sign up for what we call our membership division called Jewish Americans for Fair Education, JAFE. And then what happens with the JAFE is JAFE enables us as the Brandeis Center to use JAFE as the plaintiff in a lawsuit. So the students can remain anonymous, but they join JAFE. They become members of JAFE, and we can then, on behalf of JAFE and behalf of the members, bring the lawsuit to try and, you wanted to know what are these supposed to accomplish, right? We want to get the universities, the ultimate goal is to change the climate on campus, to get the universities to actually protect Jewish students from harassment and discrimination with the same rigor and vigor that they will protect every other group from harassment and discrimination. And we can talk about some of the steps and what that looks like. I mean, they have to start enforcing their own policies equitably. They have to recognize, as I say, that this is a form of harassment, that Jews can be targeted on the basis of our shared ancestry and ethnicity. They need to make sure their policies incorporate that. They need to make sure that there are vehicles for students to effectively inform the university of this harassment and discrimination. But they have to start applying those rules equitably so that they're not looking the other way when the Jews are the ones being targeted.
I definitely am going to want to follow up on a lot of those pieces because, it's complex and important to really hash out some of the specifics there. So we'll come back to you on that for sure. So Elizabeth, finally to you. You started a Mothers Against Campus Antisemitism, as it said in your bio, when you were trying to figure out with your son how to apply to college and were concerned about a lot of these issues. And now you have 54,000 members, which I think, you got within the first couple of weeks or so. So were you surprised by that tremendous response it has gotten? And what would you say are the major foci? What is it that people are most talking about on the Facebook group?
Yeah, so it was a complete shock to me. I really had absolutely no idea this would happen. I was a member of a few different Jewish groups prior to October 7th, and I run a Holocaust group. And one of the groups that I was in was for moms of like older teens, early 20s. So prior to October 7th, that group was mostly just talking about Jewish life on campus, who got into what school with what grades, what SAT scores, what kids were doing after school, graduate schools. It was a pretty benign page, And then after October 7th, the whole tone of the page just completely shifted. And all of a sudden, it just became about the fear that parents had for either their kids who were currently on a college campus where this was going on, or like me, they had a high school senior who was making choices about colleges and how this would affect them. And in the months that I've had the group going, I think the focus has shifted a lot. I think early on, there was this sort of ongoing debate, and there's a bit of a divide between some parents who feel there's no way I will send my child to a school with this going on. I'm not going to allow my child to be in an unsafe situation. I don't want my child in class while somebody is screaming for an infada outside. I'm not going to pay an enormous amount of money for this. I'm taking this off the list. This is a no-go. And then there's another group of parents, and I'm really in that second group, who feel, no, we're going to fight this. We're not going to be coward. We're not going to run. We're not going to be afraid of this. We have to fight it. And so much of that really depends on the child and their family and who the child is, because obviously with my son, this came up. Like, he was smack in the middle of applications on October 7th. And I had said to him, well, what are you, and one of his top choices is university, still is University of Pennsylvania. And I said, he's a really bright kid. He's super motivated. And I said, well, what are you going to do if you get there and there's people, chanting and you're seeing these vulgar signs? What are you going to do? He said, I'm going to start a counter protest. I'm going to grab some people and I'm going to start a counter protest. And I thought, that's a great answer. Okay, I will pay for you to apply to the University of Pennsylvania. But I also completely respect the opposite view, which is, a kid might feel like, I don't want anything to do with that. It's scary. I think if I were young now, I'd be terrified. I'd say, no, I'm not. Oh, no, no way. I'm not doing that. So I think early on, there was this sort of debate. And then as the time passed, one of the things that really started to happen is, and it happened with me too, is, we really started to realize that kids are not showing up on college campuses at the age of 18 and becoming rabid anti-Semites. This is starting much earlier. This is starting really early. This is starting in grade school, in grammar school. There was a library on Roosevelt Island that just had a series of books called, for aimed at for kids as young as 3. It was called Read for Palestine. Last night, I found an account on Instagram called, and I kid you not, Woke Kindergarten, with something like 30,000 followers. It had teaching material for very, very young children about Palestine. And I have just started to feel like, when I started the group, I thought, well, I've got a few bugs in my house. And now I feel like, no, it is infested with termites. This is just horrible. So there's a lot more discussion about how to stop this at the roots, as opposed to just starting it, when the kid's already on campus. So there's a lot of discussion about that. And that's pretty much.
Very interesting how it's evolved, for sure. Actually, Elisa, you had something personal connection also, just sticking with that conversation about, do you send your kids to a place that's, really scary, or do you, kind of make sure that there's no vacuum and that they're Jewish students? What's your comment about that?
I think it's true. I was actually also recently on a panel with some students who said, we are the last, and they were asked this question by parents in the audience, right? Like, why should we even continue to send our children to these universities? And they said, well, we're the last line of defense against this wave, right? That's just seems to be sweeping universities. And I had a conversation, and maybe one of the things you might be referring to, but I once I had an experience talking to a professor a retired rabbi who had taught a class in anti-Semitism on a campus, a remote campus in Wisconsin that had no Jews. And he had said that when he taught this course on anti-Semitism, he realized that he should teach a little bit about Jewish identity, because how could you understand anti-Semitism if you don't know what Jews are and Jewish identity? And he taught this course for years, and then he retired, and another professor took it over and taught his syllabus, and it was fine. And then that professor retired, and what he called me to say is, I'm very nervous now, and this goes to what Hannah was saying. The new president has now come on board and has instituted a requirement that every student has to take this diversity course. And I happen to know that I know the professor who's going to teach this class, and I know that the only way that Jews are going to be referred to in this course are as white colonialist oppressors. This is now a few years ago already. And he said, if there are no Jews on this campus for other students to meet, and they all have to take this class portraying Jews as white oppressors. He said, who's going to be surprised at the end of the day when every single student who graduates this university comes away with a negative attitude towards Jews? And that's the problem. And so, yes, it is. I have a son who also is a senior in high school and who got accepted to Columbia. And people look at me and say, are you crazy? In your line of work, why do you have a child who's going to be going to Columbia? And he's similar to your child, Elizabeth. And, I'm very proud of him. And he's ready to fight the fight. Somebody I think still needs to stay on these campuses.
Yeah.
Gabe, I imagine you're hearing from a lot of, I don't know, worried parents, worried potential students, prospective students. What kind of conversations are you having around that issue?
I'll say a couple of things. I hear much more from parents than I do from students. And I think there's a lot of anecdotes and anecdotal stories here. I do know, because I get numbers of early decisions from a lot of Jewish day schools in the country, and it seems that the ED rates, certainly to Penn, did not go down. So I think that folks realize on some level that we're in an incredibly hard moment, and that moment will pass. So I think that's an important complicating element to this. And yes, I hear from parents all the time. And we, over this past semester, one of the things that Penn did very poorly, in my humble opinion, was communicate about their policies and what was going on campus. They have brought to mind the old Woody Allen joke, who said that the food was terrible and the portions were small. So Penn had poor communication and not enough of it. So we decided to have our own webinars where I would always bring students to share about their experiences and try to represent some diversity of student experience, and just talk about what was going on and how we're advocating and what the university is doing or is not doing. And yes, a lot of one-on-one phone calls and conversations. And yeah, it's a scary time, especially, and I think we cannot overstate the role of social media in this story in a whole host of ways, obviously. One of them is the way in which social media amplifies the worst things that are going on, and really puts those front and center. And you get no sense when you're at home doom scrolling of like, how big was this thing? How dominant is this? What percentage of campus does this take up? I'm thinking about a march that took place on December 3rd, which was a Sunday. It started in downtown Center City, Philadelphia, and walked west through the city. And ultimately it culminated sort of adjacent to campus. And there's hundreds of people in the march. The vast majority of them had nothing to do with Penn, but it did walk next to Penn. And there were some really bad moments in that march. I don't want to downplay it. And the vast majority of Penn students, as that was going on, either didn't know what was happening or just were elsewhere, were studying, were in their rooms, were doing their thing. But if you were following it on social media, it felt like a 5-alarm fire, all hands on deck. So right, those are both true. So I think one of our roles is to support, advocate, and affirm, and simultaneously say, sort of contextualize and frame. So trying to hold both of those pieces.
I just want to follow up a little bit, because you're alluding to the fact that different students are having different experiences, and so I'm assuming that you're probably not discouraging people from coming to Penn when you're having these conversations, and you're talking about kind of the wider situation, and hopefully that this moment will pass. But again, we know that it's been an ongoing problem. It's not just the inflammatory what's happening right now. But tell us about the degree to which some students are maybe coming to Hillel who wouldn't have been coming before because of just, the intensity of the situation and their, the reaction to October 7th and after.
The first moment where we really saw this was pre-October 7th. We had a Shabbat together. It was the Friday before Yom Kippur. It was the Friday of the Palestine Rights Festival weekend. And we had a free Shabbat dinner, as we do all the time. That wasn't the only draw. It was really a moment of saying, like, let's just be together. There's some scary things happening. We had 500 students. We had to set up in 5 different rooms. We had many students that we just had seen once before in passing. Folks just wanted to be together. Some were there out of solidarity. Some were there because they felt afraid. Some were there because they felt proud. Some were there because they come for the chicken wraps. And we're agnostic. Those are all great reasons. So that was powerful. But what's been even more powerful, frankly, has been the way in which students are coming for Jewish learning, for our asking life's big question, for our Shulchan Ivrit to learn Hebrew, signing up for our camping trip in March, and for our volunteering in Israel trip over spring break. That has been what's been more, what has felt like, oh, this actually might be sustainable. And this might actually be a real wave of students saying, hey, if I'm going to be forced to confront some real ugliness, I want to know, like, well, what's the beauty in this heritage that I have to be proud of and that I want to learn about? So that's been, for me, one of the more exciting and inspiring silver linings, I guess, of the moment.
I just want to comment because I think that that is actually one of the things that gives me the greatest hope and inspiration. Is I also see it. I saw it after October 7th in terms of people who even reached out, who had not really been engaged with the Jewish community, but wanted me, knowing in my position, am I right, that they were members of the Jewish community and were very much, they suddenly felt this identity as a Jew, right? It was really, in many ways, an awakening, right? But I do think, I think part of the reason why we're seeing on campus the Hillel and the Chabad spaces become these kind of the safe spaces for the Jews, and why you see more students who might not have otherwise regularly frequented the Hillels or the Chabads, is because particularly, right, the social justice spaces where they used to try to find a home are no longer welcoming them, right? The communities outside the Hillels and the Chabads where they used to try to engage are now actually demanding that to be fully accepted, they shed this part of their identity as Jews in order to be fully welcome, right? They have to feel, if I want to be welcome there, I have to be able to chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. I have to be able to say Israel has no right to exist. And if I don't feel that, right, if I feel that, well, Israel has a right to exist in some borders, right? These are people who may be fiercely pro-Palestinian rights and maybe critical of the Israeli government's policies, but they feel that Israel, the Jews as a people, have a right to self-determination in some borders of our ancestral homeland, and they can no longer gain acceptance outside of the Hillels and the Chabads. And that is, coming back to the law, right? That's the harassment and discrimination that we're trying to get the universities to see, because that is not a safe, welcoming space where Jewish students are being able to fully engage in all the activities on the campus. They're not. And what's happening is they're feeling a little bit under siege, I think. And so they're coming to the Hills. But the beautiful piece of it is exactly as you say now, right, Greenberg, right? That what they're doing is once they're there, they're engaging and they're learning so much more about the richness and the depth of what this Jewish identity really is, which I do think is an amazing, wonderful thing. And I do hope that it sustains beyond, because I think that kind of Jewish unity will give us much greater strength when we come out the other end of this.
Mm. the cover story of this January, February issue of Hadassah magazine is exactly that, the Great Awakening. And it really explores both in terms of connection to Israel and Jewish identity. There's this term that's kind of out there, the quiet Jew, who's now suddenly not so quiet anymore because they're really wanting to identify. Hannah, I'm curious about your experience related to these issues that we're talking about, both in terms of connecting with, again, you're in graduate school, so I don't know like how much you connect with Hillel or Chabad, but in terms of congregating with other Jews and feeling only comfortable with your own, is that's what's happening for you?
Definitely. I mean, right after October 7th, for that first week, I found that there were very few people I could really be comfortable around. And perhaps what was most just unbelievable for me being in the Bay Area is that not every Jewish person felt what I was feeling. So I remember, one of the beautiful things about Hillel's being a very pluralist space is that people, no matter their identity or view, are welcome. And at the same time, I just remember thinking, like, there's this huge thing that happened. Don't we all come together and respond in the same way? And I was a bit surprised that that was not happening, at my Hillel. And that was the first time being, in the organized Jewish community where there wasn't that unified front. So when it comes to being a graduate student, students coming together, I mean, seeing the WhatsApp groups that students are forming from undergrad to grad to postdoc, it is amazing, the grassroots organizing. And it's especially amazing because we have, yes, there's many Jewish professionals who are wanting to support students. They're also, I mean this in a loving way, in and over their head and are undated with requests and projects. And it's kind of students taking care of other students and also parents taking care of students too. And something that I appreciated that Gabe shared earlier was the yes and framework. And that's something that I've been making space for is I would encourage people who may be grandparents or parents who are on this call is how do you empower your current student or your incoming student to hold two truths? The first truth being you will likely be discriminated against. And what do you do? What do you do when there's an issue affecting you and the policy is not enforced? And at the same time, how do you remain safe in your Jewish identity? It doesn't matter what posters you see on campus, what threats you get, what chants that you hear. What matters is that you get to choose whether you put your kippah on. You get to choose if you go to Hillel for Shabbat or whether you just go to dinner with friends who are Jewish, and that's what you call Shabbat on Fridays. So the last point I'll make, and then I'll hand it back over, is also for these students who are looking at colleges right now. Um, Not every campus Jewish life is appearing accurately in the news, and also not every Hillel and Chabad is the same. So if a student really cares about the climate for Jews, it's important that you not just evaluate community to community, but also look at what are the programs that the Hillel is doing. Go to the Instagram for Hillel. What did they say after October 7th? Did they condemn Hamas terrorism? Or did they just say, we're really sad by all of the deaths that happened and our, prayers are with people? And there's this slight nuance of, really tuning into the fact that there's, at the end of the day, we're one community, but we're different people who are responding in different ways.
Mm. And I also want to ask you how you kind of take care of yourself and deal with this emotionally, because it's got to be something that, people kind of right in the thick of it, like you, are feeling and dealing with. How do you deal with that?
hmm I've not done the best job. I wish I could say I've been doing a better job. Um, I have a partner who takes very good care of me and does what he can. I also have been spending time with friends. One of the beautiful things, though, is that I've reconnected and I've connected with so many new people in the last few months. There's actually a student at Penn, Gabe, who I've been working closely with. We met 3 weeks ago, and I'm now messaging him almost every day because we're building a national movement together. And I think that on one hand, I've not made space for some of the activities I enjoyed doing before October 7th. And at the same time, there's new friendships that have formed and, new connections I found that have been filling my cup.
Mm. What's the national movement that you're building?
Yeah, something that I've been thinking about is what's the opportunity for students to be more connected? If we look at how our Jewish community is organized right now on all these different campuses, it's in some ways top down. Top down meaning you have professionals on campus who are organizing students. You have professional organizations with layers of regional managers, et cetera. And something I've been thinking about is what does it look like to connect students on select campuses who are, doing similar efforts to then have a more unified front when it comes to the systemic change we're looking for. So it was shared earlier that a lot of the Jew hate on campus right now is related to national origin. And it starts with measuring data, right? The problem isn't necessarily DEI. DEI is just an acronym, it's not an organization. The problem is when, a certain identity is not being included when it comes to what metrics are collected for diversity. So it's going to Washington, working with the FBI and how they categorize anti-Jew hate crime, the fact that it's ethnic based, it's not just religious based. So I just did a bunch of talking. If I had to sum up everything I just shared, it would be, if you're a parent or a grandparent, really be intentional on where you send your student, ask the tough questions and like read between the lines for what the campus is within the Jewish community. And then also it's, really making clear to your student that yes, they can change a broken system and they have to remember that like they choose what being Jewish means to them, not people on the outside.
Mm, okay. So I want to go back to first of all, I want to give everybody a heads up. Our panelists have all agreed very generously to stay on. We knew that this was going to be, there are a lot of things to talk about. And with 4 people, it's hard to get it all in. So we're probably going to go to 8:15, 8:20. So you're all please welcome to stay with us. And I thank you in advance, panelists, for sticking with me. I want to go back to some of the legal questions. So, Elise, I want to ask you, what does success look like when you file a complaint? So, for instance, a complaint that might have existed, give me an example. If you find an example of one of the complaints that probably is the most effective.
So it's interesting because this actually, somebody just this morning was telling me that there had been an exchange on the MACA Facebook because there were parents who were talking about, well, what universities, right, would be okay for my student to go to. And what was reported to me is that there were some parents of students at the University of Vermont. And what's interesting is the University of Vermont is a school that the Brandeis Center filed a complaint against because there had been horrible particularly anti-Zionist form of harassment and discrimination at the University of Vermont. For example, there had been a sexual assault survivor support group that had announced that, and it was the largest, I should say, support group on campus, thousands of students, and they announced that they were blocking Zionists. This was after the last conflict in Gaza in 2021. And when Jewish students tried to reach out and engage and talk to them, they said, we don't talk to Zionists. And there was a book club similarly that had said, in order to be a member of the book club, you had to pledge no to Zionism. And they had a teaching assistant who was horrible, who over and over again would harass the Zionist students online. She even posted about the serotonin rush she got from cyberbullying the Zionists. And she had this tweet about how she asked, is it unethical for me, a TA, to deny Zionist participation credit? I think it would be good and funny. -5 points for going on Birthright in 2018, -10 points for posting a pic of yourself with a tank in the Golan Heights, and -2 points just because I hate your vibe in general. And so we filed this complaint with the Department of Education and explained, as we've been talking about, how these students are now being targeted on the basis of what is for Jewish students, these Jewish students, an integral component of their identity as Jews. This is what defines them as Jewish. And the way the administrative complaints get resolved, and we can talk about the distinction, but the way the administrative complaints, because the Department of Education has the ability to withhold all the federal funding that the university receives, the universities never want to lose that money. So what they do is they negotiate a resolution with the Department of Education where they say, okay, what steps do we have to take in order to continue to get our money? And so among the requirements, they had to modify their anti-discrimination policies and their training to make sure that it addressed what they referred to as national origin discrimination on the basis of shared ancestry. So in other words, national origin discrimination is no longer limited to just, oh, you can't discriminate against a person who's born in Israel because they're Israeli. But the idea is that all Jews are a people, and it is a form of shared ancestry, right? National origin discrimination on the basis of shared ancestry if you're going to discriminate against a Jew on the basis of their Zionism. And this, to date, is the first and so far the only resolution agreement dealing with the university campus anti-Semitism that the Biden administration has issued. The very first and only campus anti-Semitism Department of Education resolution agreement. And so it's very significant that this is what they chose and the one that they resolved, and that they recognized this specifically as a form of harassment and discrimination that they have to protect against. What happened in the MACA group, I understand just within the last couple of days, is that these UVM parents were saying it is a world of difference now at UVM. That before this complaint, students would file complaints and they'd go into a black hole and nobody would ever hear about it again. Now the university is prompt, they're responsive, they're attentive, and the parents, I think, in MACA were saying, ever since this suit, and we've heard this from students too, it's a very different environment on campus. And so what you want to get to is the position where universities are recognizing that this is actually harassment and discrimination, and they're taking concrete steps to address it when instances are being flagged for them.
So interesting. You know, I actually went on the Department of Education website, and apparently it's a relatively new thing that they now list all the cases. So they have like 5 pages worth, and again, they go back and they're not all obviously dealing with Jews. It doesn't say, you have to do like a little digging to find out exactly what the case is, but there are just, dozens and dozens of cases that now they're updating weekly. So that's interesting. We actually had a question from the audience, and I just read about this as well, and I want you to explain it. So you mentioned that that the Department of Education dropped the University of Pennsylvania complaint. So can you explain why?
Yes, so I'll explain why. So the Department of Education is completely and totally overwhelmed and overburdened right now with the number of complaints. And it's not just the anti-Semitism cases are still a small percentage of the very small percentage of the overall cases. They were busy before. Now they're getting slammed with a lot more. But one of the things that they say in their rules is that if there is another forum that's investigating the same facts, then the Department of Education, they feel, can dismiss the case, or they might not accept it to begin with. So that's one of the reasons why, quite frankly, you have to be very careful, and it's best for students to contact us before they file complaints seeking the universities to do internal investigations, because oftentimes if the universities are doing their own internal investigations, the Department of Education will say, well, we're not going to investigate, the school's investigating. That's not what happened here. What happened here is the Brandeis Center filed its complaint, and then there was a federal lawsuit that was filed. And there is a provision that says that if there's a class action lawsuit, then the Department of Education can dismiss the complaint. The lawsuit that was filed was not a class action, and so in my mind, it was inappropriate for the Department of Education, particularly now, to dismiss and shut down its own investigation, but that's the reason it's given. The reason it's given is that, well, we don't want to now be duplicating the efforts that the federal court is going to be doing, because both venues, right, both forums are going to be investigating the same set of facts, because the facts described in our complaint and the facts described in the federal complaint overlapped. So that's the reason that they closed the investigation. But they said if the federal court case closes or whatever, then you can file it again. We are now at the Brandeis Center actually evaluating what our various options are, but it's not as if this was not closed on the merits, and University of Pennsylvania is not off the hook.
Right. But it does raise the question, though. I mean, again, because there are so many of these complaints and suits being filed, again, it was big news when Harvard did it last week, but of course that wasn't the first. And, and then there are like all the filing even before October 7th. So does it raise the concern that people are just going to kind of be like, litigant happy and, raising and filing in different places and not necessarily in the best way through the Department of Education or through an individual suit, because anybody can just go to court and file a suit, right?
Yes, you raise a excellent point. So, we are really at the cusp of a civil rights movement for Jews. And you talked about how 2 years ago we were talking about this and how cutting edge it is. It's still cutting edge. And it is the organizations that have been working in this sphere really have been working now uh, to increase society's understanding, as we talk about, right, that Jews are people. I mean, universities, one of the big problems with universities for the longest time, they've always pigeonholed Jews as just a religion, right? They think the Jewish community, all they have to do is make sure that they can, observe their Jewish religious practice. So they need kosher food, they need a Yom Kippur accommodation, and that's it. The idea that the Jews are a people, that the Jews are being discriminated against on the basis of their shared ancestry, that they somehow fit into these categories of Title VI, that's not something that university administrators have been trained to think about. And so it's been a progression getting the universities to understand that, getting the Department of Education to understand that, and the Berkeley case, right, which Hannah is part of, is part of now also trying to make sure that this understanding becomes ensconced and understood and applied by the federal courts this way. So it's step by step, but there is, you're right, a huge risk that people who are not as familiar with this area of the law, people who are not as cautious or as careful, could start to file cases that don't have strong fact patterns, that could lead to bad law, or that could lead, like we've just seen now, to the Department of Education that was about to weigh in and put its finger, and push the university to really take the steps that it needs to take. They could be undermining those efforts, right? Department of Education, I'll tell you, and part of this is, right, their desire to try and get these cases moving and off their docket, has actually reached out and is interested in mediating the cases now before it. And so they're actively asking those when they open up the investigations whether they would like to engage in mediation. And the truth of the matter is that could be a terrific option to really try and short circuit what could be a very long process. Litigation can take years and years in court. And we would like to see the climate on campus improve for the students while they're still on campus, right? We don't want them to graduate before anything is done. So I do think that utilizing, I mean, there are some cases where you have to go to court. We did in Berkeley, right? We have to go to federal court, but there are some cases where I think that utilizing the leverage of the Department of Education and enabling the parties to come together in mediation to really try and discuss what steps should be taken could be incredibly beneficial. And so that's part of the reason why when you have a student who has an issue, reach out to the Brandeis Center, right? As I say, at info@brandeiscenter.com, or to the call line at legal-protection.org for the support and assistance and the guidance. Because as I
By the
said,
way, yeah,
we
we
do
have
all
those.
this without if we can help you. Department of Education, I should say, complaints, those can be done. The Brandeis Center, again, can file those. Students do not need to be named, but you can really help make a change and make a difference on your campus.
Right. And we actually have those links in our chat box as well, if anybody's looking for them. So I'm going to move to some of the questions. We have some good questions from the audience. So Ilana is asking, I want to find out if you have any suggestions to college university faculty about specific ways we can better help and support our Jewish students on campus and in our classes combating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. My college has been rather quiet. She doesn't say which college it is, thankfully, but I worry about our students and what they're confronting that I might not even be aware of. Gabe, do you have any insight into that? I imagine faculty come to you sometimes and, have this conversation.
Look, it's incredibly thorny because the question of academic freedom and open expression and conduct policies for students and for faculty, but we'll talk about faculty for a second, is such a knotty, free speech. I am not an expert on free speech, though I've learned a ton about it in the last 3 months. Reasonable people can feel, and reasonable Jewish people can and do feel have divergent opinions on free speech generally and academic freedom. Something that I worry about is ways in which the Jewish community in this moment, and I'm speaking about Penn, so I think this is replicable generally. I don't think it's in our best interest to be seen as we don't want to be conflated, the sort of pro-Israel community, with the let's reduce academic freedom and free speech in the classroom. And unfortunately, that is certainly not our intent. And that is one consequence of what is happening, is that to the degree that, and I'm part of this, to the degree that Penn Hillel and others advocate and say, hey, we need to be watching more closely and regulating what is said in the classroom, and professors who are teaching about Russian history and use their class time to read Judith Butler to their students about Palestine, which is something that happened at Penn. That seems problematic to me and many. And the process of regulating that is thorny, and we have to tread very cautiously. So I'm frankly unresolved on this issue, and every campus is going to handle it differently, and states are handling it differently. And so I don't have clear guidance here, and it's something we're certainly grappling with.
Mm.
Can I ask you a question seriously? Like, this whole thing of activist professors really confounds me. You know, I can almost understand some of the students, they're young, they're impressionable, maybe they're getting their history from TikTok, I don't know. But if you're a professor in an Ivy League school, I would think you're at the top of your game intellectually, and yet not so much. I mean, I work in a corporate environment. I'm pretty sure if my boss decided to have a meeting about something with insurance and then use that time to discuss Palestine, I think he'd be out the door by the end of the day. So why does this persist? Because the professors to me are much more frightening than the kids. They're terrifying. I don't, if this, and it's not the case everywhere. At Dartmouth, they managed to just teach, right? Mind their business and just teach. They didn't decide to also have a side gig as a Palestinian activist. How are they able to keep their jobs and do this? Because in the work world, in the corporate world, there would be a security guard walking them out the door that minute. If my boss had a meeting and started to talk about Palestinian suffering and Palestinian children, gone.
Does
So
anybody have a
it
response to that?
confounds me. It confounds me.
I think that particularly after October 7th, we're seeing many more faculty abuse their positions in the classrooms. And again, this comes down to the universities failing to enforce their rules, right? And to recognize it's one thing, and it's troubling enough, right? When you have faculty that can arguably say that whatever piece they're inserting into their class is somehow connected to their topic of their expertise and the topic of their classroom. But right, when you have the example that Gabe was describing, or I think you may have at Berkeley had a math professor who also went off on like a 20-minute piece on that's completely and totally beyond and outside what would be protected by the principles of academic freedom. It has nothing to do with their classes, nothing to do with their area of expertise. It's a highly controversial political, topic, and is inappropriate. And you do need to have administrators who will say to their faculty, enough, not in our name. Also, right, at University of Pennsylvania, one of the problems with the Middle Eastern was when the Middle Eastern Studies Center that was sponsoring the Palestine Rights Festival is doing this in the name of the university, right? The university needs to be able to say, wait a minute, not in our name, right? You can't use our logo. you can't, right? We are not going to have you spewing this anti-Semitic hatred in the name of the university, right? Or in the name, and so there are steps. Universities need to lay down the rules and then stick to them.
So we actually have 3 questions related to young anti-Zionist Jews. One relates to complaints that they're not welcome at Hillel. One relates to how do Jewish peers deal with their peers who are anti-Zionist? And well, let's start with those 2. I mean, we know that there's, a big movement that's been really louder than ever we've seen before in terms of young anti-Zionist Jews or Jews who really feel differently. And it's something that probably Jews on campus are really struggling with. Hannah, I'm going to go to Gabe in a minute, but Hannah, you must confront this, right? I think you were alluding to it to some extent earlier.
Yeah, the thought the thought I can share on that is I think that we've been taught to be either pro-Israel or anti-Israel. We've been taught to, see things in a very black and white way, and especially with frameworks that now, that you learn on TikTok of how you're supposed to see the world. And I think that actually the same thing is happening in our community, and that's a problem. So I don't really think the question is, are you pro or anti-Israel? Are you pro or anti-Zionist? This goes back to what we've shared earlier, which is just national origin. I don't always fast on holidays, and I don't keep kosher. That doesn't mean that I'm, ardently saying like, no, you can't be kosher. No, you can't do this thing or that thing. So I'd say that if there's someone who has a different view, it's going away from the label that they're putting on and rather just having a conversation of, okay, tell me more about your views. What are the facts that you're looking at? What are the facts that I'm looking at? And at the end of the day, it's respecting like a Jewish identity. It can be a religion, and it can be, an ethnic national origin component too.
Gabe, you wanna tackle that one? I'm sure it's conversations that are going on in your halls as well.
It's a critical this critical set of questions. I think that one thing one hears time and again from I use the term non-Zionist students, which contains within it anti-Zionist students, some of whom that is the term they use for themselves. Many do not call themselves anti-Zionists. They're just not Zionists. So that's already, I think, a helpful frame. And I think the posture has to be connection, reaching out and fostering relationships. You hear time and again from non-Zionist students that one major thing that many have experienced is feeling pushed out, marginalized, not welcome into mainstream Jewish spaces. And I have not met any who said, and from when I was marginalized, that made me reconsider my position. That's just like not what happens. If anything, it only heightens the effect. So to the degree that we can stay in relationship and be open and be true to ourselves and proud of our beliefs, to be curious about the thinking of the other, but only if they can be curious about you. It has to be mutual, and just to stay in relationship. This for sure at Penn Hillel has been a major part of this year, and I've had to say to students in my office who have wanted Penn Hillel to host non or anti-Zionist events or partner on those, and to say, look, that's not going to happen. We are a Zionist organization, and that's just outside of what we are willing to do. And you are always welcome here, and I love you, and I want you to come to anything you feel comfortable coming to. And B, let's remain in conversation and relationship. And C, what we do is try to find other fora for students, Zionist students and non-Zionist students, to be in relationship to one another and to humanize the other and to listen, and to find and create those areas where possible.
Can I also just comment on that, because there's even in terms of the articulation and the way we've come to it from the legal perspective. Because if you understand that, right, each individual and Jews define their Jewish identity differently. Clearly, not all Jews are Zionists, right? By the same token, as Hannah was explaining, not all Jews are Sabbath observers, not all Jews keep kosher, right? Nobody, I don't think people should be trying to say, I know how to define Jewish identity, and the way I define my Jewish identity is right. The way you define your Jewish identity is wrong. Nobody should be saying that either way, right? You recognize that each person defines their Jewish identity for themselves. At the same time, you wouldn't demand, right, if you were somebody who did not observe Shabbat or did not keep kosher, you wouldn't demand that the Hillel building do things and run activities that conflict or contradict Shabbat, or that they're constantly serving non-kosher food at their events, right? You would say, we can't be doing programs that are going to be undermining what is recognized as part of Jewish identity. And most Jews, right, will define as part of their Jewish identity. You can't demand that we run counter to that. By the same token, right, this idea of the Jewish heritage and the Jewish history and this Jewish connection to Israel and the overwhelming, right, this is the understanding that the Hillels have, that they're not going to be running programs that are undermining that part of Jewish identity. Now, when I've had conversations, I like when you talk about non-Zionists, because I've had people come up to me when I talk about Zionism and defining it this way, and they'll say the hardest conversations I have are with other Jewish students because I don't include Zionism as a part of my identity. So that's fine, right? I'm not suggesting that you should. All I'm saying is, don't suggest that a Zionist is not welcome, right? If you're part of the community that's saying Zionists are evil, Zionists are not welcome, Zionists, that's where if you want to debate the issues, absolutely right there. People, I find Jewish students are not shying away from having those difficult conversations about the policies, right? They're ready to engage on those. And we can try and create the environments where we can have those conversations about the issues. Debate the issues. Don't dehumanize the people. That's the issue. And I think that's what Gabe is getting at too, right? Try and create the atmosphere where we can have a discussion about the issue, but you can't suggest as the non-Zionist that the Hillel can't have a program that celebrates the Jews' ancestral connection to Israel, right? Just like you shouldn't be suggesting that the Hillel House should be having programs that conflict with Shabbat or are not kosher, right?
But isn't there a big difference between a non-Zionist and an anti-Zionist? I mean, to me, that's really a huge difference. You know, I had not gone, I went to Israel for the first time in 2019. But prior to that, I really had no connection one way or the other. I was sort of neutral. I have no family there, I have no connection. And I was sort of like, no. And then I went there and I really started to feel different. Then my son was bar mitzvahed and a whole bunch of different things went on between 2019 and today, obviously. So now, my views have changed. But at no point was I ever anti-Zionist. I think that's a huge difference between just sort of, and, running around and, actively being against Israel. I don't know. That's just.
Yes. Well, you're right.
Well, there's so much more we can talk about here, right? I mean, just on the philosophical and the community and who's in and who's out, and these are conversations that are going to continue, and maybe we'll all continue them at some point together. But we have a lot more questions, unfortunately, that I'm not going to be able to get to. I will say there are several questions really that I think are geared toward you, Eliza, in terms of, what do I do if? So again, we've posted the links to both the organizations that are handling these complaints. So I really encourage people, if the specific questions, to go directly to those. I'm just going to pose one last question that we have a student with us, which I'm very happy to see. I'm sure we have more than one, but Sharon has posted a question. I'm at Indiana University, and for the first time this year, there will be an apartheid week. Should we do anything to counteract it or just let it happen? Now, again, I know there's always been different perspectives on that, but Gabe, I'm going to let you tackle that one. Maybe you and Hannah.
What we do, and I like our approach, but there are others, is to show up close by, near it, in proximity, and run your own positive, joyful, proud experience, program, initiative, tabling, whatever it is, whatever one has capacity for. I think we typically think like engaging and condemning makes you look bad and combative, and that's a bit of a loser. But showing up proudly and putting out your story and our story, then people walk by and say, oh, there's a couple of, like, let me learn. That pulls people in, and I want to learn more and I want to engage with you, versus like, this is toxic, I'm out, I don't want to touch this whole issue. So that's been our approach. And I think in difficult moments, right, these are very difficult moments, I think that's what we want to try to bring to them.
Hannah, I'm going to give you the last word. I'm going to let you answer that question, but also I want you to end on a hopeful note. I want you to posit something that will leave us all with a little bit of hope as we move forward.
Thank you. So first I'll go off of what Gabe was sharing. I wouldn't have said this when I was an undergrad, but I'm going to say it now, which is that yes, have a peace week, something like that. But what students need to do is focus on evidence. Specifically, like, okay, they're having an apartheid week. Read the student conduct, understand what are the rules for their protest. Do they have to, box everything up at the end of the night? Is there a limit on what they're able to say, what they're not able to say? Really understand what the regulation is on campus and policy, collect all the evidence, take videos, pictures, etc. The screenshots of the Instagram page of, IU Hoosiers for Palestine. I don't know what they're called. And, be aware of that, because then you go to the university and you say, actually, yes, they can say whatever they want. This policy was violated though, and we feel targeted. What are you going to do about it? And depending on how the university responds, you might have a lawsuit or an investigation. And, the righteous one in me, wants to be right about this. And the other leader in me is like, oh, who cares about what they do? I think it's holding space for both. And that's actually what I want to leave everyone with, which is, as you're doing this systemic change activist work, it's how to allow, for two parts of you to coexist at once. The part of you that wants to help the attorneys with all of the data collection and streamline it and, scale the impact. And the other part of you that's like, okay, let me shut my laptop, go watch a TV show, and have Shabbat dinner with friends, or, remind myself that there's other parts to life too, in addition to this thing that is very troubling to me. So I think that's what I would want to end this on.
All right, I appreciate that. I really, a tremendous thank you to all of you. This has really been an enlightening and important conversation. I really encourage our viewers to check out the chat box where there are links to learn more about the panelists and their work, along with other related resources. Such an important conversation. So just hold tight while I go forward with a few concluding notes. So first of all, the question always appears in the chat and the Quest Q&A. There will be a recording of this program. It will be available on the Hadassah website or the Hadassah Magazine website. So look for that in a day or two. And we, in fact, can also send it to anybody who registered for this event. So please share it with others, because it really was, I think, an important conversation. And before we really conclude, I want to share a few notes about some of the work Hadassah is doing regarding anti-Semitism in the school setting. So the Education and Advocacy Division of Hadassah stepped up its advocacy and legislative efforts to stand up to anti-Semitism. One of the many actions you can take, and we alluded to this issue in the conversation, is the Department of Education. And there are efforts to reduce significantly the funding for the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. So Hadassah is urging you to call your legislators, write to your legislators to step up funding for these programs that help fight anti-Semitism, including that. And there is a link in the chat that would help you do that. Meanwhile, Hadassah's Educators Council, which is relatively newly formed, is working closely with Education and Advocacy Division to provide resources and information for educators at all levels. So they actually presented a workshop, Advocacy and Anti-Semitism for Educators, There is a link to that video in the chat box. And to get more information on the resources and activities that they are involved with, there's also a website and an email address. So for any educators among you in our audience, I encourage you to follow up with that. A few notes on upcoming programs. Our popular book series, One Book, One Hadassah, is going on the road, and I am very excited. I will be in Los Angeles on February 22nd at 7 p.m. Pacific time for a very special program with Israeli author Ayelet Gundar Goshen, the author of The Wolf Hunt. For any of you who don't know, our One Book, One Hadassah program is basically everybody reads the same book and then we have an author interview. So we are going to have Ayelet in LA with us, direct from Los Angeles, from Tel Aviv. And I will tell you that Ayelet, in addition to being a very popular author, is also a psychologist and is very much immersed and enmeshed in trauma treatment in Israel. So it's really going to be an important conversation. Her book is also very timely. We chose this 5 months ago about Israelis in America who are, among other things, grappling with anti-Semitism. So it's really going to be a great event. If you live in the LA area, I encourage you to come. There's a link to register in the chat box. If you're not in the LA area, yes, we will also broadcast it virtually. It'll be at 10 p.m. Eastern time, but if you can't make it, you can always watch the recording. And for our next magazine discussion, please mark your calendars for March 21st at 7 p.m. Eastern time, when I will interview writer Francine Klagsbrun about her soon-to-be published book, Henrietta Zold, Hadassah and the Zionist Dream. This is part of the Yale Lives, Jewish Lives series from Yale University. And a time of crisis for Israel, Klagsbrun, who's also the author of several other books, including the best-selling 2017 biography, Lioness, Golda Meir and the State of Israel, she will explore Henrietta's belief in practical, pragmatic Zionism as she reveals the person behind the legend, who is Hadassah's pioneering founder and is honestly considered one of the most important figures in American Jewish history. So again, links to both those events to register are in the chat box. As always, a huge thank you to Libby Barnea, our deputy editor, who put together this panel, and to the magazine's digital editor, Ariel Kaplan, who both promoted and produced it. And a shout out to our partners in the engagement and marketing divisions who are always instrumental with the details needed to make these events happen. And again, a huge thank you to our guests, Hannah, Gabe, Aliza, and Elizabeth, for sharing your insights and for the work you are doing to stand up for Israel and against anti-Semitism. We all need to support and join your efforts in whatever ways we can. I thank everyone in our audience for being with us today. I continue to come back. Please continue to come back for our future programming as we will address and navigate these difficult times together. Stay safe and warm, and until next time, goodbye. Goodbye, everybody.